As with all these laws that have gone into effect over the last decade or so, the big question is, why do they need to include gender identity in the sex class?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending on August 30th, 2024. We are here with Carol and me, Ariane. Let's begin with a summary of the stories we're going to cover today. Controversy erupts over a male sprinter competing as a woman in the Paris Paralympics. The UK-based charity Mermaids is falling on hard times. Courts allow pediatric transition bans to go into effect in Florida and Alabama. A Florida tourism website takes down its LGBTQ-dedicated page, and gender identity is on the ballot in New York. First, we'll begin with sports. We're turning to the Paralympics, which began on Wednesday. And like with the Paris Olympics, there is a controversy about male athletes competing in women's events. Italian sprinter Valentina Petrillo is a trans-identifying male who is set to compete in the women's 200 and 400-meter sprint races for visually impaired athletes. Genevieve Gluck has covered Petrillo extensively for Redux. Gluck reports that Katrin Müller-Rutgart, a visually impaired German female athlete set to compete in the race against Petrillo, is concerned that Petrillo has advantages over biological women. Meanwhile, on Twitter, lesbian tennis icon Martina Navratilova called Petrillo a pathetic cheater, retweeting a post from the group Fair Play for Women. This is another story in the ongoing saga of women's sports being imperiled by self-identification and the denial of biological reality. The IOC and other sports bodies need to come to their senses and realize their credibility is at stake. Now, turning to the UK-based charity Mermaids appears to be going broke, or at least that's the impression they gave on their call for donations on Facebook on Thursday. In their post, they complained that the Charity Commission's inquiry into them has forced them to tighten their belts and that they have to make some difficult decisions about their staff. For those of you who don't know, Mermaids is one of the UK's biggest proponents of gender transition for minors. In 2022, The Telegraph did an investigation on them, alleging that they gave chest binders to minors without their parents' consent. The Charity Commission opened an investigation into them in response to complaints raised following the Telegraph's report. The investigation is still ongoing, hence Mermaids' call for funds. Hat tip to Barry Wall on Twitter X for reporting on the story. Now, some legal stuff. So on Monday, the 11th Circuit Court allowed Florida's law SB 254 to go into effect. This law bans the medical transition of minors and also requires that adults who want to medically transition must go through a doctor rather than a nurse practitioner or some other medical professional. As some background, SB 254 was passed in May of 2023, but a permanent injunction was issued blocking the law in June of this year. Monday's 11th Circuit Court ruling removes that injunction and allows the law to go into effect. The 11th Circuit made this ruling because it believes it's likely the state of Florida will ultimately prevail in defense of the law. A few days later, on Wednesday, the 11th Circuit Court issued a divided ruling in favor of a three-judge panel ruling that overturned a preliminary injunction against Alabama law SB 184, which bans pediatric transition. Let me reword that to untangle all those double negatives. So in April of 2022, Alabama passed a law banning the medical gender transition of minors. In May of 2022, U.S. District Judge Lyles Burke issued a preliminary injunction against the law, arguing that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution gave parents a right to access medical care for their children. Then last August, a three-judge panel removed the injunction. saying there was no constitutional right to gender transition when the 14th Amendment was adopted. This allowed the Alabama pediatric transition ban to go into effect. But then that panel decision was challenged and brought to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And on Wednesday, the 11th Circuit agreed with the panel's decision removing the injunction. That is, Alabama's law banning pediatric transition can go ahead. The court was deeply divided on this issue, with 5 separate opinions being issued. All 5 Republican appointee judges ruled in favor of the panel decision, while all 4 Democratic appointees were in the dissent, and one other judge recused herself. It should be noted that neither of these rulings mean that the Florida and Alabama pediatric transition bans are completely in the clear. They simply mean that these laws are allowed to go into effect while challenges to the laws work their way up through the courts, and we'll keep you updated on the status of this law. May very well go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So with that, Carol, what do you have?
Thanks, Ariane. So Florida's tourism marketing website, Visit Florida, quietly took down part of their site that marketed directly to the LGBT community. The move has many LGBTQ orgs and activists angry and calling the move bigotry. Visit Florida, which is the site, is a public/private partnership between the state of Florida and the state's tourism industry. The state contributes about $50 million each year to the agency. Florida has been one of the more active states in pushing back against gender ideology, and I suspect this might have something to do with that. Unfortunately, like many people, they don't seem to make the distinction between gender ideology and same-sex attraction. A byproduct of the forced teaming of gender with homosexuality, as we all well know. We know the backlash is happening, and it's unfortunate, and I think that this case is one of those situations of backlash, getting a whole bunch of people rounded up in it that shouldn't be. And now I'm going to turn to New York. So on the ballot this November in New York, there will be an initiative to include gender identity as a protective class. They will do this by including gender identity under the sex category in the state's current constitutional list of protected characteristics. According to the TURF report by Kara Dansky, quote, a pertinent provision of the state constitution currently reads, no person shall be denied the equal protection of the law of the state or any subdivision thereof. No person shall, because of race, color, creed, or religion, be subjected to any discrimination in his or her civil rights by any other person or by any firm, corporation, or institution, or by the state or any agency or subdivision of the state. Prop 1 would add the following into law, quote, ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, and sex, where sex includes sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy, pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive health care and autonomy. Earlier in the year, the measure had been removed from the ballot because it had been introduced and passed on the same day in 2022 without any hearings, which was a violation of state law. Women's rights organizations have come out against this measure because it includes gender identity under the category of sex, which makes protection of women and girls based on our sex meaningless in the law. If anyone can identify as a woman, then woman is no longer a distinct class worthy of its own recognition and protections. As with all these laws that have gone into effect over the last decade or so, the big question is, why do they need to include gender identity in the sex class? Why not make it its own protective class? Certainly, we all can agree that no one should be discriminated against for expressing themselves in a way they feel comfortable or for having beliefs that don't align with the majority. The big issue, as I see it, isn't that gender identity is a protective class, but that trans activists want someone's belief about themselves to override fact and law. Laws have to be based on facts. If they are not, how do we implement them fairly in a society where many different beliefs exist? We will keep you up to date as the story continues. So Ariane, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that was very well said, and I'm a little bit confused. When I was hearing you describe this proposed amendment, it sounded like they had all these individual things like ethnicity and whatnot that's separate from sex. And then in sex, they bunch up all these different things under sex.
Yeah.
And it's strange to me that they decide to go down that route. I mean, it's not really surprising because of all the politics about sex and gender that have been going on, but what it seems to me is it shows that we can't, for some reason, people are having a hard time really taking sex seriously as its own thing. And so it has to be bunched up with all these other issues, which we don't do with like ethnicity or whatever. So that's very disconcerting to me that we're having a hard time letting sex just stand on its own right as
Yeah,
a
yeah,
protected
and
character.
that was my confusion out of it too. And I've thought this from the beginning when all these laws started popping up to protect trans ideology or trans identity. Um, because I don't have a problem, like I said, I don't have a problem with protections being implemented for people's beliefs or whatever they want to do. However, you can't, sex does exist, and there are, you have to have protective classes. Why not just they already, like you said, they already added in a ton of other stuff. Why not just add gender identity as a separate thing?
Yeah, and I go further too, like sexual orientation. I mean, I think sexual orientation should be protected.
Yes, I
Yeah,
agree. That too. Why is that in with sex? That doesn't make any sense.
yeah, that's another weird one. Um, I would actually argue if you're gonna bunch up gender identity with anything else, it would be more like political beliefs or religious beliefs. I think it
Yeah.
actually fits neater there. Not that I would necessarily do that either, but I think it makes more sense in that way. So sorry, could you repeat what were all the things that were bunched up under sex?
Yeah,
Or
like there was a ton of them. Okay. So ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, and sex, where sex includes sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive health care and autonomy.
yeah, so I
That
could
is a
see the
lot to put under that
yeah,
category.
I could see the reproductive stuff being lumped in with
Yeah.
sex. Yeah, but that those are the most natural fits. And I mean what it shows the reason why they're clustered the way they are, it must be just an activist thing, the
Yeah.
same groups, the whatever LGBTQ groups, and unfortunately, a lot of these feminist groups now, like the National Organization for Women, are packaging all of those things together. And so politicians are getting information from these groups and they're writing their laws according to what these groups are saying, not according to what actually makes sense.
Yeah. And you have to ask yourself, if the sex class, who is being helped by specifying that sex, you shouldn't be discriminated based on your sex? Who's benefiting from that, and who has historically benefited from that, and why were these laws put into place? Women. So there's your clue. I think, why are women not being protected, and girls?
That's a good
So
point.
it really, it does fit into what, some of the other feminist organizations who are not for this have said, which is this is a violation of women and girls protective, protection under the law.
Exactly. And I'm curious to see how they're going to deal with all these contradictory claims about sex discrimination and versus gender identity discrimination. It's like what we reported last week about the Australian case, the Tickle versus Giggle. When gender identity was codified into law, it meant that women could not have their organization or their app in this case according to women as a biological sex class. And in fact, gender identity trumped biological sex.
Well, and that's what they're trying to do, right? That is the point of this. The point is to do away with sex as a concept, as a class, as anything. It's all about gender identity. Um, that's what it's ultimately about. It's let's do away with sex as a class. Let's not recognize it anymore.
Yeah, and so I'm now curious how I'm not living in New York, so I'm curious how the advertisement, for this it's like a ballot initiative, isn't it?
Yeah. And that will be in, I found the link to that. So that will be in the description if people want to read that stuff for themselves. But it really just says, oh, look, this is the existing one. We just want to add this stuff in. And I think most people wouldn't think twice about it. Just, oh yeah, let's protect more people. Why not? That's great. But like with all of these things, um, the details is what matters. That's where they get you. And then once you get this implemented in law and in constitutional law, what then?
That's exactly my worry. A lot of people are just going to see the protections for sex class. And I wouldn't be surprised too, particularly with all the, the controversy over abortion. There'll be people who may be like, yeah, I want to protect, reproductive health care in the law. And they're not gonna see they're not paying attention to all this other stuff really. And
Yeah.
I don't think it's my guess is that supporters of this initiative are not gonna be advertising, the by
No.
the
And
way,
that was one of
gender
the issues.
identity is covered too.
And that was one of the issues that came up. They didn't even have hearings on it. Nothing. They just pushed it through in one day. And that in 2022. And that's why it was actually pulled from the ballot, because you can't do that. You can't just push something through that with no hearings or anything, or not letting the public even know about it. But you got to ask yourself, why are you doing that? That seems, why are you trying to keep things in the dark?
Yeah, interesting. So this isn't like one of these people gathered signatures and put it on the ballot.
No, this is from the yeah, it's from the lawmakers themselves. And I was thinking and looking at this, gender expression gender expression as its own protected class would make more sense, and it would cover all of this, right? You can't, because that covers everybody pretty much. That covers gender identity, because expressing a gender that is maybe different than what people think you should, or what is, your sex. That's fine. That makes sense to include. So why not just put that if you're really concerned about protecting people?
That is an excellent point. I think gender expression is sort of an underrated concept in this debate because, like you said, yeah, it does cover some of the stuff with like trans and gender identity, but also just people in general who are gender nonconforming, which are
It
disproportionately gays and lesbians, but
Yes.
anybody. That's something that, yeah, I've always thought that there should be better protections for that sort of thing.
And it
And
also protects women more in the workplace from not being forced to wear, certain clothing that women are supposed to wear, right? Which
mhm.
historically has been just really an issue. Oh, you have to wear dresses or skirts or these type of shoes. And, if women wanted to wear, you know, slacks and a button shirt, she should be able to.
Yeah, and wasn't that sort of what was going on too with that Supreme Court Bostock case that was about that has been used for all this trans stuff that it was a that the trans identified male am I remembering this correctly? It had something to do with like a funeral service that had a strict dress code about
Yes. And so he was cross dressing basically. And they
yeah.
said, no, you can't do that. Now, that's something you can argue in the courts. Should people be allowed to quote unquote cross dress? You know,
Hmm.
um, although he was actually also wanting to use the female facilities there. And there's where you have a problem, right?
Yeah.
But this stuff is getting all lumped into one thing when it really should be separated out and said, look, this is okay, but this is violating boundaries. You know,
Mhm.
you can dress how you want, but no, you cannot go into facilities that your sex is not. Like, you can't, women, you cannot go into women's, and women don't go into men's. Like,
Yeah, that that's a good point. Now I'm curious to read more about the term gender expression because I that was something I definitely heard at least since like college. I remember getting a presentation by what I think was a butch lesbian talking about how she's been discriminated against more for her gender expression than for her sexual orientation, which I think was an excellent point. But now it does seem like that concept is is sort of being sidelined in lieu of identity. And so that's an interesting cultural shift there that
Yeah, because I would have to agree with this butch lesbian that you talked about, because that's been my experience too. I've gotten more pushback and more, people treating me poorly because I am quote unquote gender nonconforming than anything else. But of course, the way I look also, I think, informs them right away that I am a lesbian. So I don't know. They go hand in hand. So, you know,
yeah, it's an interesting conflation. I mean, I've definitely in terms of how much discrimination against butch lesbians is motivated by homophobia and sort of the tip that that person's a lesbian versus, well, they'd be okay with a more feminine lesbian. Like, it's sometimes hard to know, you
yeah.
know?
So I don't know. I just think the gender expression would be a really good thing to push and a really good thing to just have as the encompassing protection. And it protects everybody. I mean, you've heard a lot of you've heard a lot of butch lesbians come out and say, come out in the support of the trans identified males because they don't like getting mistreated in public restrooms or whatever like that. And they're like, oh, I know how it feels, but it's like that's not quite the same thing. But yes, you are onto something. That is gender expression. He shouldn't be kicked out of the men's room or harassed or whatever because he wants to wear a dress, and you shouldn't be kicked out because you want to wear quote men's clothes. That's where the line is.
Yeah, and I think that's also an excellent point about why some lesbians are supportive of a lot of the claims that trans make. Yeah.
The empathy, yeah, yeah.
Well, that was a great discussion. We're curious if anyone listening wants to leave their thoughts, please do so in the comments. And with that, we look forward to seeing you again next week. Please remember to like and subscribe. Goodbye.